And so it's very striking that you differentiated between material and psychological needs in the report. Can you tell us a little bit more in particular about what you found out about psychological needs, what they are and how they're being met?
There are sort of two pictures which begin the report, and although I don't have PowerPoint here, I'll just use my hands to describe them because they sort of sum the whole thing up. If you can sort of close your eyes, I imagine. The first is we did a picture of essentially economics and income, with women on one side, men on the other side, the richest at the top, the poor at the bottom. And the shape of society is like a kind of sort of onion or garlic, with the top stretching away, with the very rich becoming much, much richer, a sort of poor stuck at the bottom, and a middle group steadily, rising up in terms of income. The picture of psychological well-being is almost a mirror of that. It's a sort of inverted onion, with most people relatively happy with life. But as in the case of the lengthening spike of the very rich, a thickening and lengthening spike of the unhappy, the stressed, the anxious, the depressed. And obviously there's a fascinating question of how these two stretchings relate to each other, how a more unequal society, more atomized, more perhaps market-driven society perhaps produces greater stress and insecurity. And then in terms of the analysis we did, we're quite lucky in having long time series data in Britain which does measure things like feelings of autonomy, feelings of competence, feelings of relatedness. And out of that you can sort of map both the material and the psychological against each other. And in a very crude way, what we were trying to find out was sort of divide the population into four groups. The sort of happy wealthy, the unhappy wealthy, the happy poor, and the unhappy poor. To put it very, very crudely. And partly to raise the issue, material poverty does tend to correlate with being less happy in life, mental illness and so on. But there are significant groups who are materially quite poor, but doing pretty well in life, usually because they have strong family supports, strong communities, strong networks and so on. There's a smallish but large number of really miserable rich people, living in vast houses out in the suburbs, no one to talk to, and so on. And so the question which was raised by all of this is, what are the different claims to be made of those people against the happy poor and so on, and how might we as a society respond to each of those claims? And just to give a couple of numbers, one of the other prompts for this was data in the US, which showed that between 1984 and 2005, the proportion of Americans who say they have no one to talk to about important things has gone up from about 10% to about 25%. A quarter of the whole country, no one to talk to. An extraordinary change, coinciding, interestingly, with the spread of the internet and so on. And we found in Britain a slightly different picture, but about 1 million people who on almost every measure had no one to turn to, no one to support them, no one who appreciated them. And other sort of measures which came out in the detail, things like 500,000 pensioners spending Christmas Day on their own. About 7 million people feeling a significant deficit of social support. Anyway, in this you'll see all sorts of different ways of trying to get into, as well as the lived experience of psychological well-being and psychological need.
I read something recently, it was actually written by Tom Steinberg, who's known to both of us, but he was flabbergasted when he found that in Kenya they did some research, and that among kind of the lowest income Kenyans, they were spending up to 75% of their disposable income on mobile phone telecommunications. And that kind of reminded me, you look in the report about how needs have changed over time, and again kind of focusing on the psychological needs, but what did you find there?
Well, mobile phones is an interesting one. We had a sort of team doing this work, but I did quite a few interviews myself, particularly with refugees and undocumented migrants in London, Birmingham, and also with children in care, teenagers. There are two groups who are pretty much at the bottom. And whenever you do these quite sort of 2-hour interviews about someone's life, they're all complicated and fascinating. But with both groups, one thing became very clear, which was the single most important item of spending was the mobile phone. If you were, if you come from the Congo, let's say, and were living in Britain, you'd be stuck in a small flat or a room on the edge of the city. This was the way you kept in touch with almost everyone else who could be useful to you. And they were willing to forego meals, to forego going on the bus in order to pay for that mobile phone. It was the biggest item of spending and also the most important one. And the teenagers as well, again with almost no cash, were willing to go, at least they said, and we then did actual real deep dive ethnography where our researchers would spend the whole week sort of living with teenage mums and other teenagers, and definitely vindicated this, and going without everything again for this source of connection to other human beings, which the mobile phone has become. I'm not quite sure what follows from that. Should you provide free mobile phones for everyone? But it was a very striking message about, again, going back to where you started, the human need for connectedness, really outweighing almost everything else. And some of you will be familiar with the Abraham Maslow theory of a hierarchy of needs, which was fashionable in the 1950s. It was debunked in the 60s, but nevertheless, as often happens with these ideas, carried on.
I was just writing about it yesterday.
Anyway, our research proved, as many have before, but perhaps even more starkly, that idea of a hierarchy of needs, and the claim was you first of all meet your need for sustenance and housing and food, and then you sort of rise up the hierarchy towards self-actualization, is not in fact how human beings work at all. And some of those, our most basic need is our need for other people.
So, have you kind of come up with can you explain a framework of needs that came out of this work? Did you kind of move to that place where you sort of say, well, Maslow didn't get it right, it looks like it's more like this?
Not really, because we found it was quite different for different people, different stages of life, different situations, and so we were wary of generalising. But the other thing which we did try and emphasise, and which the follow-on work from this is really about, is trying to make sense of the relationship between needs, which are kind of a deficit, a thing you don't have, and strengths and capacities. And in a way, this whole project draws in part on the work of Amartya Sen and others, trying to look at people's capabilities and capacities rather than just at deficiencies which someone else, a state or a philanthropist, fills up. And quite a lot of the report is looking at differential strengths, differential resilience to cope with shocks and setbacks. And we argue, and the analysis seems to show, that everyone faces setbacks. Things go wrong, your relationship falls apart, you lose your job, you go bankrupt, you get beaten up in the street. It matters hugely how you cope with those shocks. And that's partly a matter of disposition and psychology and character, some of which can be learnt, can be trained. And there's a fascinating program underway which we're a little bit involved in the American Army at the moment, trying to teach psychological fitness to 1 million American troops. A lot of it, though, is about social supports. You're much more likely to be resilient if you have close friends and family who are there for you, that's to share the setback, to help you find your way out of it. And some of this as well, in the studies we did in Middle England, Bedford in particular, but in London, we were really struck at the difference between the teenagers who were kind of getting on with life and succeeding and the ones who were failing, boiled down quite a lot to what we call help-seeking behaviour. The successful ones were really good at just seeking out help for anything they needed, often helped by their parents. They would find someone to advise them on what university to go to, how to get an internship somewhere, where to travel. Whereas the sort of horrible phrase NEETs, the not in education, employment and training teenagers, particularly ones with a mental health problem, found it very hard even to identify what they needed help with, let alone to ask for it, let alone to go through the doors of a public agency which was officially there to help them. And therefore, their lives were dramatically stunted by this absence of help-seeking behaviour. So we do have in here a number of essentially models of need, but they're models which focus in particular on resilience, help-seeking, and how you really orchestrate the resources to help you deal with your needs. rather than the need itself, which is quite fluid and variable between